Daniel Mercer walked into the Civic Center with a backpack, and within minutes, Charlie Kirk lay bleeding on the stage as hundreds screamed in terror. Unaware the calm figure slipping into the crowd was the very shooter who had just changed their lives forever. The evening had begun like countless others, a crowd gathering at the Denver Civic Center for what was expected to be a routine community event. People arrived in waves, chatting as they made their way inside, unaware that within an hour their lives would be changed forever. The hall buzzed with excitement. Charlie Kirk, a figure who always drew strong reactions, was scheduled to speak. Attendees filled the seats, phones out to capture the moment, waiting for the lights to dim. It was supposed to be a night of speeches, questions, and the same ordinary rhythm that such events always followed. No one noticed the hooded figure moving among them, head lowered, avoiding attention, carrying nothing more suspicious than a backpack. Security checks at the entrance had been brief, and no one thought to stop a man who looked just like any other restless attendee. The moment came quickly, without warning. Just minutes into the introduction, sharp cracks echoed across the hall. For a fraction of a second, many assumed it was something mechanical, a speaker malfunction or a dropped object. But the truth sank in as screams erupted, people pushed against one another, and the air filled with panic. The gunman had risen from his seat, lifted a small handgun, and fired into the crowd. Several rounds struck the stage, and one hit Charlie Kirk, who fell backward, clutching his chest as his microphone clattered to the floor. The sound system cut into static before a security guard ripped the power. Pandemonium followed. Men and women dove to the floor, covering their heads, knocking over chairs in their scramble to get away. Parents dragged children under tables, while others bolted for the doors, creating a bottleneck of terrified bodies fighting for an exit. In the chaos, the shooter seemed calm, almost detached. CCTV footage later revealed the eerie composure with which he acted. He didn't linger or fire wildly. He had chosen his target, taken his shots, and then lowered the weapon as though nothing had happened. While people screamed and trampled over one another, he blended into the stampede. His hood covered his face, his steps measured, deliberate. Within 30 seconds, he was gone, swallowed by the wave of panicked civilians, who never realized the man brushing past them was the one responsible for the blood spreading across the stage. By the time the first officers burst into the hall, he had already slipped outside. The Civic Center became a crime scene in an instant. Dozens of officers moved in, securing the perimeter, while paramedics pushed through the frightened crowd to reach the injured. Charlie Kirk lay motionless, bleeding heavily, his condition critical. Emergency responders lifted him onto a stretcher, rushing him out through a side door as cameras flashed. News spread before the ambulance had even cleared the parking lot. Phones streamed shaky footage online, people screaming, the echo of gunshots, the blurry figure raising a weapon. Within minutes, the country knew what had happened. Comment sections exploded with speculation, conspiracy theories, and raw fear. The words, "shooter on the loose," crawled across the bottom of television screens nationwide. Inside the building, agents worked to gather what evidence they could. Chairs lay overturned, purses and shoes scattered in the rush to escape. Glass from broken windows littered the floor. Witnesses were pulled aside, their statements chaotic, contradictory. Some swore the shooter had been tall, others said short. Some described a heavy build, others insisted he was slim. The only thing consistent was the memory of the hood, and the calmness that seemed unnatural in the midst of violence. Security footage from the Civic Center offered more clarity. Cameras positioned at every entrance captured angles of the suspect, though none provided a clean look at his face. In one clip, his hand appeared steady as he raised the gun. In another, he could be seen moving toward the exit, while everyone else scrambled in the opposite direction. It was haunting to watch, a killer moving with quiet confidence through a scene of panic. The FBI was called in within hours. Local police admitted the scale of the crime went beyond their capacity. This wasn't random violence, they believed, but something deliberate, targeted, perhaps even orchestrated. Analysts began pulling every second of digital footage from the Civic Center and surrounding streets. Investigators mapped the shooter's path, noting how quickly he vanished after the attack. He had known the exits. He had known where cameras were. This wasn't the work of an unplanned, impulsive act. It was methodical, and that realization unsettled even the most seasoned agents. By the time night fell, the city was in lockdown, helicopters circling, officers checking every alley and side street. But the man who had just changed the course of an ordinary evening was gone, leaving behind only a trail of confusion, fear, and questions no one could yet answer. The hours following the shooting unfolded with a mix of urgency and frustration. Investigators pored over footage from inside the Civic Center, reviewing frame by frame the moments after the shots were fired. What struck them most was not the attack itself, but what happened immediately afterward. The suspect never panicked. As people screamed and crawled across the floor, he simply lowered his weapon, tucked it into his waistband, and joined the frantic tide of bodies rushing for the exit. It was as though he had rehearsed his movements, each step precise, every gesture designed to blend in. He did not run, he did not shove, he did not even look back. That calmness unsettled every agent who studied the video. It meant the escape wasn't improvisation, it was strategy. Outside, street cameras picked up his trail for a short while. He pushed through a side exit, slipping into a narrow alley behind the Civic Center. There, his behavior shifted. With deliberate motions, he peeled off his dark jacket, folded it over his arm, and dropped it into a dumpster. Moments later, he removed the hooded sweatshirt that had obscured his face, revealing a plain white t-shirt beneath. He adjusted his posture, slowing his pace as if he were just another bystander leaving the chaos. When officers arrived at that very alley less than 10 minutes later, all they found was the discarded clothing, an empty path, and the lingering echo of sirens. The city quickly transformed into a maze of checkpoints and flashing lights. Patrol cars blocked intersections while helicopters circled overhead, their searchlights cutting across rooftops. Yet, despite the massive response, the shooter melted into the night as if he knew the city's blind spots better than anyone. Witnesses provided contradictory accounts. One person claimed he saw a man sprinting into a parking garage. Another insisted he boarded a taxi heading north. Several said they never saw him leave at all. Each tip was pursued, each lead turned cold. The FBI realized they weren't chasing a reckless gunman, but someone trained to disappear. Analysts pieced together footage from the blocks surrounding the Civic Center, connecting fragments from different cameras. A figure matching the suspect's build was spotted walking calmly down a street 2 blocks away, head lowered, hands in pockets. In that clip, he wore a baseball cap pulled low, an item he had not been seen with moments earlier. Investigators speculated he carried disguises in the backpack, prepared to alter his appearance within seconds. The detail confirmed their fear. This wasn't the act of desperation, it was the work of careful planning. The precision of the escape created a chilling impression. The suspect seemed to anticipate the police response, knowing exactly how long it would take for officers to arrive and which exits would remain unguarded in the first critical minutes. He navigated the chaos as though he had studied the building beforehand, memorized the layout, and identified every camera. By the time investigators arrived at the edges of his trail, he had vanished beyond the reach of surveillance. The final image captured by a street camera showed him slipping around a corner, never reappearing on any other feed. Public reaction to the escape was immediate and intense. News outlets broadcast the shaky clips on repeat, pausing at the grainy frames where the shooter's hood partially revealed a face blurred by poor resolution. Commentators questioned how a man who committed such a brazen attack in front of dozens of cameras could simply vanish in plain sight. Online forums exploded with speculation. Some believed he had inside help, someone who guided him through a predetermined path. Others claimed it was evidence of a larger conspiracy, that the escape was orchestrated to create fear rather than just to kill. Regardless of the theories, one truth could not be denied. The shooter had outmaneuvered every layer of security designed to stop him. Behind closed doors, the FBI debated the significance of the calm retreat. Agents with military backgrounds noted the controlled breathing, the lack of wasted movement, the way he blended without hesitation. It resembled the behavior of someone who had trained in high-stress environments. This raised troubling questions about his past. Was he ex-military, a security contractor, or perhaps someone who had studied tactics without ever serving? The lack of information only deepened the mystery. Every detail suggested professionalism, yet no database returned a match to the blurred images they collected. It was as if the man didn't exist. The discarded clothing from the alley was sent to labs, but even that offered little comfort. The jacket carried no fingerprints. The sweatshirt had been washed with harsh chemicals, erasing any trace of DNA. The weapon was nowhere to be found. The methodical erasure of evidence reinforced the idea that the suspect had not only planned his attack, but had thought several steps ahead about how to vanish afterward. Each revelation painted a picture of someone who had committed not just an act of violence, but a performance of control. As dawn approached the next morning, the Civic Center stood silent, cordoned off by police tape, its broken glass glinting in the early light. Investigators worked inside while outside, reporters shouted into cameras about the manhunt that was already stretching thin. The suspect's escape wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a statement. He had demonstrated that he could appear in the middle of a crowd, unleash chaos, and then walk away unchallenged. The thought lingered in the minds of agents and citizens alike. If he could vanish so completely once, what would stop him from doing it again? The days after the shooting brought little comfort. While Charlie Kirk remained in critical condition, the attention of the public shifted almost entirely to the identity of the man who had nearly killed him. The FBI expanded its search across Denver and beyond, calling in extra resources, canvassing neighborhoods, and pressuring bus and train stations for security footage. They worked under immense pressure, knowing that every hour without a suspect increased the likelihood that he would vanish permanently. Analysts spent sleepless nights examining recordings from traffic cameras, storefront security systems, and even amateur footage uploaded by residents. For days, most of what they found led nowhere. The man was like a shadow surfacing in grainy frames and then disappearing again. But then, buried in the clutter of surveillance data, came the first solid lead. One of the traffic cameras positioned several blocks from the Civic Center picked up a man in a baseball cap carrying a backpack. He was walking with an unhurried pace, head tilted slightly downward to obscure his face. The timing matched perfectly 20 minutes after the shooting. Investigators froze the frame, zoomed in, and compared the build to the figure seen firing inside the Civic Center. The posture, the proportions, the deliberate way he held his arms, it all aligned. This was their suspect. Following the footage further, the man approached a bus stop, blended into a group of commuters, and boarded a bus heading north. Agents quickly contacted the bus company, retrieving onboard surveillance footage. Although the images were far from clear, the suspect sat at the very back, slouched low, his face concealed by the cap. He got off after only 2 stops, slipping into a neighborhood filled with older apartment complexes. At first, it seemed like another dead end. But investigators noticed one detail that changed everything: the shoes. In every clip, the man wore the same pair of sneakers, distinctive and rare, with a unique design that was only released in limited numbers. It was a tiny clue, but it was enough to crack the case open. The FBI traced sales records of that particular sneaker model. Only 3 pairs had been sold in the entire state in the past 6 months. 2 were paid for with credit cards, their buyers easily identified and cleared. But one purchase had been made in cash at a small sports shop outside Denver. Security footage from that store showed a man whose body type and build matched the suspect perfectly. Though his face remained partially hidden under a hood, the resemblance was undeniable. He had walked into the store weeks earlier, purchased the sneakers, and left without leaving a trace of personal information. Cross-referencing with local records, investigators connected the appearance in the store footage to a 29-year-old named Daniel Mercer. Mercer was a former private security contractor with a reputation for instability. He had been dismissed from his job months earlier after several violent outbursts and a troubling incident involving a firearm. Neighbors described him as quiet, withdrawn, and often seen leaving his apartment late at night. Online, he had left behind a trail of cryptic rants under anonymous profiles, filled with anger toward political figures and vague references to cleansing corruption. Though none of the posts mentioned Charlie Kirk directly, the tone suggested a fixation on political targets. When the FBI raided Mercer's last known address, they found it empty. Dust covered the furniture, and it was clear no one had lived there for weeks. What they did discover was chilling. In the bedroom, pinned to the wall, were maps of Denver with routes marked in red ink. Several points circled on the map matched exits around the Civic Center. On a desk sat 3 prepaid cell phones, all wiped clean, along with receipts for bus tickets purchased under false names. Most disturbing of all were disguises laid out neatly in a box: hoods, caps, wigs, and even fake glasses. Mercer had not been living like an ordinary man. He had been preparing for something. The discovery painted a disturbing picture. Mercer wasn't a random shooter who had snapped in the moment. He was organized, deliberate, and deeply methodical. He had studied his target, planned his movements, and built an exit strategy designed to mislead investigators at every step. The sneakers were his only mistake, the single thread that connected him to the night of violence. Public reaction to Mercer's identification was explosive. The FBI released a statement acknowledging they had a primary suspect but warned the public not to approach him. News outlets plastered his name and blurry photos across every screen. Yet some questioned whether Mercer was truly acting alone. His background as a security contractor suggested he had the skills to stage the attack, but his escape seemed almost too clean, too precise, as if someone else had been guiding him. Online speculation grew louder. Was Mercer a lone wolf, or was he part of something larger? Agents pressed deeper, chasing any hint of Mercer's current location, but with every day that passed, he seemed to slip further away. Phone records, bank accounts, and travel logs yielded nothing. It was as though he had erased himself from existence before pulling the trigger. His image circulated across the nation, but sightings were fleeting, unreliable, often disproven within hours. The case was no longer just about the shooting. It had become a test of how far one man could push against the system designed to catch him. Mercer's face became a ghost in every crowd, his name whispered in every corner of the internet. and the FBI knew, with unsettling certainty, that the man they were chasing had planned for this exact moment. He had fired his shots, disappeared, and left the country watching shadows, unsure if he was still hiding nearby or already planning his next move. The hunt for Daniel Mercer intensified as weeks passed, the FBI pouring manpower and resources into locating him. What had begun as a high-profile shooting had now evolved into a manhunt that dominated headlines. The sneakers that had first pointed to him became the cornerstone of the case, a rare mistake in an otherwise flawless plan. Agents followed the trail with renewed determination, certain that the smallest details might reveal where Mercer had gone. What they uncovered next would shift the investigation from speculation to revelation. Tracing the sneakers had led investigators to the sports shop where Mercer had been caught on camera. That grainy footage became the starting point for deeper analysis. The timestamp, the body language, even the way Mercer carried himself was examined by behavioral experts. He appeared disciplined, with movements suggesting a background not just in private security but in something more formal. His stance, his precision, and his ability to operate under stress pointed toward tactical training. This realization put pressure on agents to move quickly. A man like Mercer wasn't just a threat because of what he had already done. He was dangerous because of what he still might attempt. Agents pulled every file on Mercer's past. His employment records revealed he had been part of a security contracting firm that operated in high-risk environments overseas. Colleagues described him as skilled but volatile, prone to paranoia and bursts of anger. After being dismissed for insubordination, he drifted between low-paying jobs, each ending abruptly. Financial records showed a sudden withdrawal of nearly all his savings 3 months before the shooting. Investigators believed he had converted his money into untraceable assets, possibly using prepaid cards and cryptocurrency. He had been preparing to vanish long before the attack. The breakthrough came when analysts combed through local surveillance networks outside Denver. On the night of the shooting, Mercer had been spotted entering a parking garage. Cameras showed him walking inside with the same backpack seen earlier. But what caught attention was that he didn't leave in the same footage. Instead, another figure emerged minutes later wearing the same sneakers, the same jacket, and even the same baseball cap. The second man walked out in a different direction, calmly, as though picking up the trail where Mercer had ended it. This footage unsettled the FBI. It suggested Mercer had not acted alone. There was at least one accomplice, someone equally trained in deception, who had been there to ensure his escape. The theory of an accomplice forced investigators to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the crime. The escape route suddenly looked less like instinct and more like choreography. Each discarded item of clothing, each shift in appearance, might have been part of a handoff between two men working together. Witness accounts that had previously seemed contradictory now made sense. Some had seen a man running, others a man walking calmly. Both had been true because there had been two men in play. The FBI scoured every lead connected to Mercer, trying to identify who could have been helping him. His online activity revealed a network of cryptic connections, accounts that interacted with his posts but used false identities. Cross-referencing those accounts with IP addresses pointed to several cities across the state, though most were dead ends. One lead, however, tied back to a former colleague from his security contracting days, a man with a history almost as checkered as Mercer's. This man had disappeared from records months earlier, quitting his job and cutting ties with family. The possibility that Mercer had recruited him added a new layer of urgency to the manhunt. At the same time, the search of Mercer's abandoned apartment revealed evidence that he had been planning his escape with meticulous care. Maps showed routes not just in Denver but stretching into neighboring states. Prepaid phone cards suggested communication without traceability. Agents found a collection of disguises, but also something more disturbing: lists of public events with dates and locations. Some already past, others in the near future. It was impossible to know which ones, if any, were targets. But the implication was chilling. The shooting of Charlie Kirk might not have been an isolated act. It could have been the beginning of a larger plan. Public fear grew as these revelations became known. The FBI released statements confirming Mercer as the primary suspect but remained vague about the possibility of an accomplice. News outlets speculated endlessly, painting Mercer as either a lone extremist or the front of a broader conspiracy. Online forums dissected every detail, with some claiming he was a ghost agent trained by intelligence services, others convinced he was part of a shadowy organization bent on destabilizing political figures. Amidst the noise, the truth remained elusive, and Mercer's whereabouts were still unknown. For investigators, the evidence only deepened the mystery. The discarded clothing, the disguises, the deliberate erasure of personal traces. It all painted a picture of someone who had planned for every scenario. But the appearance of the second man in the parking garage footage shifted the stakes. It was no longer just about catching Mercer. It was about uncovering a network, however small, that had enabled him to slip through the cracks. The idea of two skilled men working together, capable of appearing and vanishing without leaving a trace, terrified even the most hardened agents. By the end of the 4th week, the case had ballooned into one of the most complex manhunts in recent memory. Leads pointed in multiple directions, yet Mercer remained a step ahead. His ghost-like presence haunted every investigation. His image replayed endlessly on television, a reminder of how fragile public safety could be when someone so determined and disciplined chose to exploit it. For the FBI, the challenge was no longer just catching a shooter. It was unraveling the careful illusion of control he had created. One that made it impossible to know if they were chasing a single man, or something much larger hiding behind his shadow. The investigation had reached a fever pitch by the time the FBI publicly confirmed Daniel Mercer as the prime suspect. His name and blurred images dominated news cycles, his face appearing on every major network, his story dissected by analysts and online communities alike. Yet despite the wall of attention closing in, Mercer remained elusive. The revelation that he may not have acted alone only heightened the fear. If there was another man involved, someone equally skilled at blending into the shadows, then the scale of the threat was even greater than first believed. The sense of dread spread beyond Denver. Across the country, public events faced increased security. Political gatherings were canceled, and whispers of another attack circulated endlessly. But what no one expected was the new footage that would throw the entire case into deeper mystery. The video surfaced from an unlikely source, a security camera inside a downtown parking garage, recorded hours after the shooting. Investigators had originally dismissed it, believing the timeline didn't fit. But when an analyst reviewed the footage again, a startling detail emerged. The camera showed Mercer entering the garage alone, carrying the same backpack seen in earlier clips. He walked toward a dark corner and disappeared from the frame. Minutes later, another figure emerged, nearly identical in clothing and build. But something about the stride was different. This second man left through a side door and vanished. The timestamp confirmed the footage had been captured at a critical point in Mercer's escape. The implication was undeniable: there were two men working together, both using identical disguises to confuse surveillance. The discovery shifted the narrative completely. The public had been told one shooter was on the run, but now there was evidence of an accomplice, possibly even a double. If Mercer had switched places with another man, it meant investigators could have been chasing the wrong trail in the hours after the shooting. The FBI realized the discarded jacket and hood in the alley might have belonged to the accomplice rather than Mercer himself. What had been seen as mistakes could now be evidence of a deliberate strategy to fragment the investigation. This tactic explained why witness accounts had been so contradictory. People hadn't been mistaken, they had seen two different men at different times. Agents scrambled to identify the second figure, combing through Mercer's connections. Old colleagues from his contracting firm were interviewed, some reluctantly. One name repeatedly surfaced: a man who had vanished from official records months earlier. A former partner known for his ability to disappear under pressure. Though investigators never found hard proof tying him to the shooting, the possibility that he was the accomplice grew stronger with every lead. The FBI hesitated to release his name to the public without confirmation, but behind closed doors, the working theory became clear: Mercer had never intended to act alone. At the same time, analysts studying the materials from Mercer's abandoned apartment found chilling clues pointing toward future plans. Among the maps and prepaid phones were lists of public events across multiple states. Some of the dates had already passed, but others were only weeks away. Each event involved high-profile figures, and investigators could not determine whether Mercer or his partner intended to strike again. The documents suggested a campaign of violence rather than a single isolated act. The FBI increased security nationwide, but the fear remained that Mercer and his accomplice were already moving toward their next target. The public release of the parking garage footage had a dramatic effect. The images, though grainy, were broadcast endlessly, showing the eerie handoff between two men who looked almost interchangeable. It played into the growing sense of paranoia, the idea that anyone in the crowd could be Mercer, disguised and hiding in plain sight. Online speculation surged, with theories that the duo had been part of a larger organization or were mercenaries for hire. Some even claimed the FBI was withholding information to avoid panic. The narrative spiraled far beyond the facts, but the truth was unsettling enough: two men, coordinated and careful, had staged an attack and vanished into the night. For investigators, the case became a battle of patience and precision. They sifted through every tip, every sighting, knowing that most were false alarms. Yet the occasional glimmer of hope kept them pressing forward. a gas station receipt that matched Mercer's known purchases, a blurred figure caught in a motel camera, an abandoned disguise found in a dumpster. Each clue hinted that the men were still moving, staying just ahead of capture. What haunted agents most was the realization that Mercer seemed to be enjoying the pursuit. He had released chaos into the world, and every day he remained free, added to the legend of his escape. The final twist of the case came not from the FBI but from Mercer himself. A package arrived at a local news station containing a flash drive. On it was a short, silent video clip of two men sitting side by side in a dimly lit room. Both wore the same sneakers, the same jackets, their faces obscured by shadows. One raised a hand in a slow wave, almost mocking. The clip ended abruptly, leaving only questions. Analysts could not confirm the time or location, but it was enough to prove that Mercer and his accomplice were alive, together, and taunting the authorities. The footage was released to the public, sparking a wave of panic and fascination. The hunt for Mercer was no longer just about catching a shooter. It had become a psychological game, a battle of visibility and control. The FBI was forced to admit that the case remained open, the suspects still at large. For the nation, the uncertainty was unbearable. Somewhere out there, two men who had already brought terror to a crowded hall were walking freely, planning their next move. The release of the CCTV footage, instead of bringing closure, only deepened the mystery, leaving everyone to wonder when, and where, they might strike again.